Together, I wanted to have lots of music and wow, lots of music. What's really impressive is actually how well we're doing on time. I wrote a really short sermon for today. Now I know some of you were really excited about that.
That's your going away present.
That's right. That's all right. I'm going to stretch some of your memories today, I'm sure. There was a new preacher in town. He came to the church. He had a great first Sunday. He really preached, and the elders were really excited, and the people were pleased, and they all went home after church that day thinking, life is finally good. They came back to church the next week. They actually had a little bit bigger crowd because the elders had gone off and told the people around them how good the preacher was, so some of those people came. And the elders were a little disappointed because he preached exactly the same sermon he had preached the week before. The same sermon. The elders were a little concerned. They didn't go home that day so happy. They didn't go home and tell their friends that they needed to come hear this preacher because they were starting to think that he maybe only had one sermon. Sure enough, the third week, the preacher preaches the same sermon again. And now, the elders aren't just disappointed, they're miffed. Because they had had good references about this guy. They had heard some of his other sermons. So they called him in for a meeting with the elders. They said, you need to do better. You need to preach a different sermon every week. Because the people will get tired of hearing the same one over and over and over and over again. And the preacher nodded his head. Says, I can see how that could happen. But when you interviewed me, I told you that I was really a pretty simple preacher. And that I try to preach what God tells me to preach. And he says, what God has been telling me is that I need to keep preaching the same sermon until you start doing what I tell you to do. I have a question. Who's here brave enough to tell the world that you were here on my first Sunday? Look at that. Good. Dick, I think you were there. I think you were. And what they can tell you if they research the deep recesses of their mind is I told that sermon that day almost 10 years ago. I told that story 10 years ago because I am a fairly simple preacher and pastor. Now the good news is, or the bad news, depending on how you take it, is that I haven't preached the same sermon for 10 years. Of course, it would make it easier. You'd all know all the words. But I want you to know that in the last 10 years, we've gotten some things right at First Christian Church in Gurnee, Illinois. Here's some of the things I want to share with you that we've got right. We have hospitality at First Christian Church down pat. We have greeters and people who will welcome you in the building and bring you in and make you feel like you've belonged here for years and years and years. And that's hospitality. We have the best funeral meal ministry I've ever seen or ever been a part of. That's hospitality. We know how to take and bring in people from a college choir and put them to work, and they feel like they belong. Now I can say that because this isn't the first time they've been here. This is the 5th time that we've had things together with the College of Lake County. Would you please thank them? Here's something really important to know. They wouldn't have come back 5 times if they hadn't felt welcome. They wouldn't have. They'd have said, well, thanks for the invitation, but I think we have other things to do. And it was all true. They all gave up things that they had to do. We have hospitality down. We have worship down here, I believe. We do a blended worship service. We try to make everybody happy, but really what we try to do beyond everything else is pay attention to the Spirit of God moving in this place. Which is why when things don't go exactly according to script, Gail, what do we say? It's okay. Because God, Gail was the first one to point that out to me. About 8 years ago. Because God moves in this place. And we listen. This is the first church that I ever served that didn't have a clock back on that wall. To remind the pastor when the Bears play. You know, the other 3 churches I've served, I took the clock out. One person finally noticed in Wansika, she says, "Where did the clock go?" I said, "I took it down the day I arrived." It was 6 years before anybody noticed. Or at least had the guts to tell me. God doesn't operate on a time schedule. God comes and goes when God desires to come and go. And that's why when there's something exciting happening in worship, we let it happen. And sometimes that means changing where you sit. Sometimes that has meant changing the music in the middle. Sometimes that's meant, well, I don't know if I ever didn't preach, but one of those things. We have worship down. Part of worship is we have music down. Anybody notice that? We know how to do music at First Christian Church. All of those things have led to deeper faith and deeper involvements with one another. And that's something we do at First Christian Church. Deeper faith, deeper lives together. Means lives changed around you. Here and everywhere. I have to tell you that over the course of years there have been various bits of memorabilia that I have handed out. I handed out money once. I don't have enough for this room. In fact, I don't have enough of anything that I have back here on the pulpit for everybody, but you know, we talked about Jesus being the rock of our lives. And everybody left with a rock. I still have mine. I still carry it. I carry one in my wallet. John remembers he carries his in his pocket. My guess is many of you can go home and on the top of your dresser, probably a little dusty, is your rock that says, believe. If you need a rock, after church. My favorite image, though, is what I've preached for 8 years. A fat pig. I I still remember very clearly the day I stood up here in the pulpit and said to my congregation, "You all need to grow up to be fat pigs." Some of the looks were not pleasant. But for 10 years, I've really been talking about this image. It was just in the last 2 years that the image really came clear to me. Because here at First Christian Church for 10 years, we've talked about being a place of intentional grace, where people are loved and accepted and forgiven, where relationships are more important than rules, and where God's Spirit is listened to first of all. So I began to play with that image, and we came up with the image of the fat pig. Because that means that we have to be, repeat after me, faithful. Wow, that's pretty good. I didn't even have to give the right word first. Faithful, available, teachable, people of intentional grace. Let's do that again. Faithful, available, teachable, people of intentional grace. Turn to a neighbor and say, "Be a fat pig."
Be a fat pig.
If you don't have a fat pig, I invite you to get one of those after worship as well. As a man who, for the last 6 months, has been shrinking, my final word to you today, my final word to you as your pastor, as one who is larger, is to remind you to be a family. Because no matter who comes to fill this place, if you're living life as fat pigs, his or her job is going to be much easier. Because when we live as fat pigs, when we live faithful, available, teachable lives of intentional grace, the world changes. First, our world changes. And then the world around us changes. And then, just like what the back says, the whole world changes. Simply because of how we live. So, my friends, leave here as a great big fat pig. We have a hymn of invitation. It is an invitation to make a commitment to Jesus, an invitation to make a commitment to this church. And if you feel called to respond, I invite you to come forward and meet me here at the communion table. We invite you to stand up. Let's stand together as we sing, "Lord, I want to be a Christian."
In my
You know, the preacher doesn't get caught off guard very often. It's her job in life. This is Christy. And she's coming to transfer her life and membership officially to the First Christian Church in Gurnee. I'm going to tell you that Christy is one of the first non-members of First Christian Church I probably ever met. She was working. I happened to go in. She was looking for a place to come and sing. I said, "Come sing!" So, Chrissy, I'm going to ask you the same questions we ask each and every person to the same circle. Do you believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God? Christy's going to get to stand at the back. She just wanted to really shake off. This is such a blessing.
Thank you.